one thing that I like to emphasize in my grand rounds, which maybe some of you have heard the scientific talks that I give in medical audiences, is I always show the slide of the Chinese calligraphy for the word mindfulness, okay? Because it's the symbol for presence, or now, over the symbol for heart. Presence of heart, okay? That's only like, thousands of years old, okay? When they translated the Indian, the Sanskrit, or Pali texts into Chinese in the early Agama Buddhist writings, that's the symbol that they use for mindfulness, for sati, or satipanya, presence of heart. So anybody who hears the word mindfulness for the first time, and believe me, with the word mindful, with the magazine Mindful out there, and everybody now interested in mindfulness, so that is mindfulness, 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 everybody's talking about mindfulness, 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 mindfulness. It's kind of sickening. Wonderful, I'm not knocking it, I always wanted it, but once it comes, then we have to adjust a little bit. So if you're not hearing in English the word heartfulness, when you're hearing the word mindfulness, you're not understanding it at all. You're taking your conceptual, maybe if you're a cognitive therapist or something, you're just taking your own, repertoire of thought structure, and you're thinking you understand what mindfulness is, and you have no idea what mindfulness is. If you're not anywhere near, and even if you have an idea, it's just an idea of mindfulness, okay? This is about embodied practice. It's about embodied practice, both on the mindfulness side and on the compassion side. And believe me, it is not easy. What we're asking of ourselves at this particular juncture, and we need to remember it over and over, is only the hardest thing in the world for us human beings. To show up even for one instant with openness, spaciousness, and kindness. His Holiness the Dalai Lama is famous for saying, "My religion is kindness." You can get off the train now. Everything else, footnote. Are we under any illusion that that's easy? Oh, I get it, I'm sorry, why didn't I know that? Why didn't I realize that? Or people who hear about mindfulness, oh yeah, right. Paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally, and the awareness that arises from that in acting, from that embodiment. Why didn't I ever hear that before? I mean, of course, I got it. Thanks a lot. Adios. I'll just be a little bit more mindful. You're not going to make it out the door. I mean, the door is a long way away. You're not going to make it out of your seat before some little egoic thing grabs you and, likes and dislikes come up, or wanting or not wanting or whatever it is. And it's like, that's where the rubber meets the road. That's the beginning. That's not, failure. No, that's the practice. That's when we get something to work with, to hold in awareness, with kindness, with self-compassion. Why is it so hard for me to actually be me? And to always need something else to complete me, to want this or to not want that, and to live in fear, and to drive myself crazy, and to drive everybody else crazy, especially the people we love the most. And we're all like, well, I'll just speak for myself. I'm a world expert at that. This is hard. And then, if you're trying to introduce people to it and convince them, this is now mindfulness or compassion, best thing since sliced rye bread, you got to do it. You got to sit there and breathe and feel your breathing. And it's like wonderful, it's like, what Kool-Aid have you drank, I mean, if you're talking about like people out there, and you're trying to make the case that this is great and it looks an awful lot like nothing, and then boredom sets in within 30 seconds because hey, wait a minute. Maybe there's something more interesting on my phone. Or I could text somebody. And people do this. I was at Wisdom 2.0 a year or two ago, and half the people had their iPads out, and they were tweeting, "I'm meditating with Jon Kabat-Zinn." And I called them on it. I called them out on it. I said, you're not meditating with Jon Kabat-Zinn. You're distracting yourself and pretending that you're meditating, but you can't do two things at once. Multitasking has been shown not to work. So you're like, yeah, you're meditating. But I tell you, we're at, Even Lincoln Center has devoted hundreds of seats to tweeters because they're afraid they won't be able to fill Lincoln Center anymore because there are people that will not come to concerts unless they can tweet about it. What about listening? What about listening to the concert? And then sort of afterwards you could say, yeah, it's like you can have something to say about the concert. But while it's going on, or I'm meditating with Jon Kabat-Zinn, what a joke. And it's not about meditating with Jon Kabat-Zinn, it's meditating with yourself. Nowhere in sight. Myself, nowhere in sight. So I like to say, that while it looks like mindfulness is much ado about nothing, and somebody from the outside can say, well, we pay for this, there's sort of like the health insurance companies are paying for MBSR, people like 45 minutes, they're just sitting there doing nothing, and health insurance pays for it? Yep. But it's not because it's nothing. It's what I like to say sometimes is that it's much ado about almost nothing that turns out to be just about everything. And in my experience, that's true. And what it really is when we take our seats in this way, what we are taking, it's a radical act in the face of all the chaos inwardly and outwardly of our minds and our desires and our fears and our hopes and how badly damaged we get in the trajectory of life and how often how unseen we are sometimes and disregarded in a way that's just profoundly hurtful. And it leaves scars, especially when it happens in utero or in early childhood. In the periods of the maximal development of the brain, trauma is horrible in what it actually does. And all the stress scientists are saying this. We know enough now that we should legislate against that kind of thing to a very high degree, because when the brain is online as an adult, but it has not had the chance to develop out of kindness and compassion, in a sense, everything else is kind of remedial. And yes, it can do a lot. And with neuroplasticity, we can regain a lot. But why? This is like preventive medicine 101. And we need the Congress to enact that kind of thing, because the policy is not going to come out of the researchers. So it's much ado about nothing, about almost nothing that turns out to be just about everything. But it is hard for us, and I think we need to recognize that. The other thing is, and this talk is going to be a little bit, what should I call it, impressionistic, nonlinear. And the reason being is I'm not talking to your heads, just in case there's anybody who thinks I am. I'm talking to your hearts, or to your whole being. And I'd like to recommend in the introduction that last book that was mentioned called Mindfulness, Diverse Perspectives on Its Meaning, Origins, and Applications, that Mark Williams of the Center for Mindfulness of Oxford University and I were asked by an obscure Buddhist journal to host and guest edit an issue of this journal called Contemporary Buddhism, where we invited Buddhist scholars from different traditions, mindfulness teachers, MBSR teachers, people, educators and so forth, to talk about, in conversation with each other and researchers, what their view of mindfulness was. And this turned out to be by far the best-selling issue of the journal ever, and so they've turned it into a book, and no matter how hard we tried to convince them to make the book like $15 or $20, they made it more like $40 or something like that, because they're a scientific publisher. But I recommend that you read this book, because the individual papers in this book are masterpieces of inquiry into this whole not knowing, but exploring, both historically and in the present moment and for the future. What are the active ingredients here that we can bring together to actually promote learning, growing, healing, and transformation in this new era that we're in? And I was joking at Wisdom 2.0. I said, why do we need wisdom 2.0? What's wrong with wisdom 1.0? We haven't gotten there yet, and already we need 2.0. And I offered that basically as a koan. I really do think we need wisdom 2.0. I don't think that the old, it's not that there's anything missing in the old, but I think that the translation and the embodiment and the incorporation needs to be adequate to what we are facing now. And what we are facing now is not what people were facing in 500 BC. It's just not. Are we the same more or less? Yes. Do we have the same minds? Yes. And also no. And even the same bodies or nervous systems? Yes, and also no, because we're immersed in a complexity that actually nurtures the brain in particular ways, for better or for worse. So one of the articles in this book is by John Teasdale, who's a world-famous cognitive scientist and cognitive therapist, one of the 3 originators of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. And it's the second of 2 articles with Michael Chalskison called something like How Mindfulness Liberates Suffering. Okay? So when we are talking about compassion or loving kindness or mindfulness, what we're really talking about is suffering. What MBSR was designed for was to catch people falling through the cracks of the healthcare system. That's almost by definition suffering, because they go to hospitals because they're suffering, and often people do not get full satisfaction from the medical system. I don't know if you've noticed that. So why should the hospital and the medical center not take responsibility for holding the whole of things and catching the people that are not getting fully satisfied and challenging them to do something for themselves that no one else on the planet can do for them? And to tap into deep interior resources that we all already have. It's not like we have to acquire anything, but that we can cultivate intimacy, or as the Tibetans say, familiarization with the landscape, with the territory of our own hearts and minds and bodies, and relationality with everything and everybody, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, awareness itself, which the Buddhists consider to be a thought, proprioception, interoception, all of these things, and educate ourselves, so to speak, inwardly and outwardly, in how to be in wiser relationship with how much we're hurting, to start, because that's often the motivation, how much we are hurting. And so just to say that MBSR itself is meant to be a resource that the hospital can bring that is actually compassionate. It's like a compassionate net to hold people and then to recognize who they are, even when they may not realize the full repertoire of it, and say, we have faith that you can actually exercise these muscles that you don't even know you have. And that itself is an act of self-compassion. That is itself an act of wisdom, to take care of oneself in that way. And that no one can do it for you. We have to do this. But we do it with tremendous gentleness, with tremendous kindness, but also a certain kind of rigor, that we're going to pay attention to things we do not want to pay attention to, that we do not want to face. We're going to put the welcome mat out for the full catastrophe, the good, the bad, the ugly, one movie title after another. And hold the whole of it.